So here we go. So again, thank you for the kind invitation. We're going to talk about our Mapping for Change project that looks at questions of environmental inequality and questions of environmental resistance in Peterborough and Nogojiwanong. So first, we are both going to start with our own land acknowledgements, and mine was quick because I'm here. I'm zooming to you in the same place. I'm in Peterborough, close to the Otonabee River, actually, as we speak, in the lands covered by the Williams Treaties, and on Michi-Sagig territory. So I'm grateful to live and learn in this place, and I'll pass it along to Michael.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, just to echo thanks that Stephanie articulated. Yeah, we're really pleased to be here. So I'm in Toronto, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I think it's worth pointing out as well that I'm a white settler in these lands, and because of that, that's afforded me and my family vast unearned privilege. You know, we'll sort of unpack that and talk a bit more about that throughout the course of this discussion as well. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to work in these lands, and I, endeavor, in the best ways I know how to use this unearned privilege to confront and dismantle, these structures of, white supremacy, racism, etc. Also, I'm in the habit when I do these land acknowledgements of trying to sort of signal boost good work that's going on in the world. So I've just put a link here in the chat to the Indigenous Environmental Network, and they've been doing some work to try to quantify the extent to which Indigenous kind of resistance to various energy projects in particular, the kind of impact that they're actually having. And they've found that Indigenous resistance to oil and gas projects has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canadian emissions on an annual basis. So I think what this demonstrates is that this kind of activity and action actually has real sort of concrete impacts on our sort of collective environment. So anyways, you can read more about the Indigenous Environmental Network through that link that I just put in the chat.
Great, thanks, Michael. So what we want to talk to you about today is this project that Michael and I started talking to each other about in 2021. So it might seem like a bit of a shift in terms of what my work is normally about. I had just finished a book on the history of wolves in Canada, and it was kind of working its way through publication processes and stuff. And I was starting to think about a new project. And I realized after I finished that book that for me, I felt like the book was important. The research, I really enjoyed the research, and there was lots of things that I liked about it, but the thing that I didn't like about it in the end was it didn't actually seem to change anything, and it didn't seem to change anything in the place that I live. And so Michael and I started talking about working on a project that might have on the ground impact around questions of environmental justice in the place that we both used to live at that time, or both worked at that time. And we talked to, so it started in May 2021. We talked to lots of potential collaborators about how it might unfold, and ended up settling something like a strong partnership with Community Race Relations Committee of Peterborough and the Kawartha World Issues Centre. It's sort of rooted in this question of, should we be paying attention to the fact that there might be something in terms of how environmental harm occurs in Peterborough and who it might affect. So that's kind of the root of this. And we've been lucky all along in a couple of ways to have first the most amazing advisory committee, who's including Reem, who have been guiding us through this process. And secondly, to have the project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which has enabled us to undertake this work for the next 3 years. Michael, I think it's you. Oh no, it's me. So the broad research objective that we our entire project is framed around is to build this baseline of information about environmental justice in this place, as a means to intervene and change those conditions. So really, this is kind of an action research project that seeks to engage the community and for us to learn from what the community is doing to affect change around environmental harm. This one is definitely you, Michael.
Michael, you're on mute.
Stephanie did say this might be messy, so here we go. You were forewarned. Yeah, if it wasn't clear yet, it should be now that we're in the very beginning stages of this project. So we don't have a whole bunch of results to report, although we do have a few things to sort of talk about closer to the end. But so we're going to be talking more about the kind of project itself, not so much about the findings at this point. So in terms of the research output, sort of what we intend, as Stephanie mentioned, we really want this to be a kind of public-facing, action-focused project. And so really what we envision creating through this process is a free and publicly accessible, living kind of digital archive of the data, images, maps, stories, a film. I think we're planning to make a film as well, documenting kind of oral histories of the area. So again, what we envision, because and we'll talk a bit more about this at the end as well, but it's actually hard to get data for this project. And so what we want to have is both sort of polished outputs. So again, in terms of images, the film, these kinds of things, but we also want to make available any of the data that, the kinds of numbers that we're able to sort of get our hands on and make that available as well. So if other people want to go in and use that data to, do their own sort of analysis, I mean, that will be up on this website ideally as well. So really a kind of repository of work that could potentially be also built on by either us or others sort of going forward. This is me as well, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really three sort of key questions here that's kind of motivating and guiding the work. So the first is what form does environmental injustice take in Nogo/Peterborough? This is something that we just don't know. We have a sense of, I think we're all somewhat familiar with certain areas in the city maybe that are greener than others, certain areas that are closer to factories, these kinds of things. But at a kind of sort of systemic level, what does this look like in the Peterborough area? The second question, I did do an edit on this, but I see it didn't make it, somehow it didn't translate into, anyways, this should be, I think, what is environmental harm racialized, gendered, and classed in Peterborough area? Again, we have some sense of how this plays out in other locations, mostly in the US, although we will talk about a couple of notable cases in Nova Scotia and Halifax area. But we want to try to figure out how environmental harm, again, is racialized, gendered, and classed in this area. And then importantly, we didn't want to just focus on the kind of the bad news. We also wanted to celebrate all the good work that's going on in the Peterborough area every day to try to make conditions better for both the natural environment, but also the people, animals, things that are in Peterborough. So we're also interested in how and where organizations and communities are kind of responding to environmental injustice in the area as well. And again, we'll celebrate this, I think, through things like the images and films, etc.
Great. So I think though we need to take a bit of a step back too and talk about the ways in which how environmental justice is framed and how that impacts how we understand environmental injustice and how all of this applies to our broader research project. So environmental justice starts with the basic environmental human rights. And what it suggests is that all people are entitled to equal protection under environmental laws and to participate in environmental decision-making in their community, and that all people have a right to a clean environment, have a right to a clean and safe environment. But environmental injustice signals that this doesn't always happen. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, specifically, taking lots of inspiration from the civil rights movement in the United States, social movements began to recognize that environmental hazards are disproportionately cited in equity-seeking communities, particularly in racialized, Indigenous, and poor communities. And so environmental injustice then is when some people bear the lion's share of the unintended but important side effects of the production and consumption sectors that we benefit from. So air pollution, water pollution, these sorts of things. But this movement also arose out of a critique of the mainstream environmental movement that was characterized by a lack of attention to race and class. And so there was a critique of the big, the Sierra Club and various other these big environmental organizations, that they cared more about owls than people. And that they critiqued this movement for ignoring that environmental harm also hurts specific people too. Oh, I'm not moving. There we go.
So to kind of put a fine point on this, really, when we talk about environmental injustice, we're sort of talking about this intersection here of the environment and people. Lots of people have noted that, actually these two things aren't separate anyway. We are, after all, just nothing but, flesh bags. We are nature as well, right? I mean, there's sort of no way around it. We're nothing but sort of biophysical nature in human form. And so, but the important thing with this kind of environmental justice lens is layering over that kind of equity piece onto it as well. And it brings into view things, for example, like the fact that those who are often most harmed by environmental bads, also the people who don't have access, for example, to decision making, to sort of policy levers, to the kind of the kind of political access that could sort of help change things. And so then this, of course, compounds the issues of environmental injustice very often. There's a scholar, Jim Charter, and he's put it that some live more downstream than others, right? So this is sort of echoing what Stephanie had just said about the fact that disproportionately Indigenous people, Black people, lower income people, etc., typically bear the heaviest burden of environmental harms. So just sort of unpacking this a little bit more, we use these terms gendered, racialized, and classed rather than race, class, and gender in recognition of the fact that these things are actually socially constructed. So, for example, lots of people have written about the ways in which gender or race or class are sort of performed, right? There's a kind of social sort of construction element to that. But of course, this doesn't mean that these socially constructed categories don't actually have real material impacts. And again, we'll talk a bit more about this a bit further on. In fact, these things determine, as we know, many important, many kinds of health outcomes. If we think about, health outcomes, all kinds of different things, where we live, the color of our skin, or, the sort of gender, all these kinds of things end up impacting life opportunities, health outcomes, and also, it turns out, access to environmental goods, right? So these things are very, very important to think about in the context of, quote, the environment.
So a key consideration to pay attention to, both like in the broader environmental justice movement and the way that we're thinking about it here in Peterborough, is a question of environmental racism. And environmental racism was has been defined as part of the environmental justice movement in the United States in the 1980s, as, and I'm quoting here from Chavez, racial discrimination in environmental policy making, the enforcement of regulation and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movement. And this has had a number of manifestations that have been well documented by environmental justice scholars. For instance, increased exposure of racialized folks and Indigenous folks, as well as disproportionate citing of harmful facilities, higher instances of environmentally related health issues that Michael was talking about as a result of that disproportionate exposure. So, outcomes around asthma, for instance, are kind of much higher in African-American communities in the United States than they are among white communities. There is also, people talk about environmental blackmail and the advent of dirty jobs. So in communities that don't have a lot of economic choices, often polluting facilities will locate there and offer jobs to community members who, as I said, don't have a ton of choices otherwise. And as we sort of said all along, another piece of this is a lack of environmental amenities or a lack of green space in the places where people live. So what this culminates in is what Rob Nixon, who's actually an English professor but writes about environmental justice, has called slow violence. And by slow violence, he means the kind of environmental harm that has a source that's in many ways harder to pinpoint, and occurs over decades, right? It's like this, long sort of experience of harm. And so what we might think about there is, obviously the impacts of something like climate change are a sort of slow violence, the chronic effects of toxic exposure, a lack of clean drinking water, or the inaccessibility of environmental goods. All of these things fit broadly under the umbrella of environmental injustice, and often fit within the definition of how environmental racism happens. So this is a map that I use in teaching. And it's old now, I guess. I think I'm old now, I guess. But I think it's one of these maps that's really helpful to come to understand this relationship. And in part, it is because often when the environmental justice movement first started, people would say, well, isn't this really about class, right? Isn't this actually about income rather than race? And I think what this map shows is that it, certainly it's difficult to separate race and class, right? But I think what this map shows is that it is actually about race, at least in the way it's manifested in the United States. So this is a map of Connecticut. What it's showing you is the darker blue areas are the percentage of what they call minority, or we might call equity seeking or equity deserving groups. And the yellow dots are point source pollution, or it could be, any number of sort of, factories or utilities, power plants. It could be refineries, though unlikely in Connecticut. It could be hazardous sites, waste dumps, all of these sorts of things. And I show this to my students because it makes it tough to ignore the relationship between race and potential for environmental, bad environmental exposure. And, I think sort of this kind of mapping, and this is the kind of mapping that we're interested in doing because it has this real power to it, right? It tells the story in a way that I think is easily digestible for most people, and it's also quite understandable to policymakers, right? It's this sort of mapping is particularly what we are interested in bringing forward. And so, and I think it kind of maybe points to one of the questions around environmental injustice, which is, that there's a lack of distributive justice. And by distributive justice, what folks are talking about is this equitable distribution of environmental benefits and risks. And so what we see in environmental justice communities is that those environmental benefits and risks are not equally shared, that some people bear the burden of environmental harms, whereas other people like me don't feel those burdens at all. So there's the distributive justice piece, and then there's also the procedural justice piece, which is those same people, as we've mentioned kind of frequently throughout this presentation, also don't have access to decision making. So achieving environmental justice means achieving both distributive and procedural justice. And I think sometimes in Canada, and I'm not saying that the Canadian situation is different, but I think sometimes in Canada, there's this narrative that problems regarding racism occur mostly in the United States. And it is right to suggest that problems around racism occur in the United States, but I think it would be wrong to suggest, of course, that those kinds of problems only exist in the United States. So a kind of big inspiration for this project was Ingrid Waldron's work in Nova Scotia. And you may know Ingrid Waldron if you haven't read her book or gone to the website, the Enrich website, where this map is taken from. You may know her work from the movie There's Something in the Water, which starred Elliot Page, which was about, you know, the fact that of environmental racism in Nova Scotia. And what Ingrid Waldron found in her team, she found that Indigenous and Black Nova Scotians were more likely to experience environmental racism and also to be on the front lines of advocating for environmental health for everyone. And so this map, and it would, I should have put the website rather than the map, but what this shows, the darker colors show a higher population of racialized and Indigenous folks, and the dots here are polluting facilities. So her map, you know, is very similar to the one that I just showed of Winnipeg. And there's many examples of this in Canada. There's, of course, grassy narrows. There's the existence of long-term water, boil water advisories across Canada in First Nations communities. There's Chemical Valley in Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And then there's also less obvious examples, I think, which maybe are closer to home.
Yeah, so here is some work. It's actually put together. I'll put a link to this in the chat as well. Recently put together, well, by CBC and Jayla Bernstein. So what we see here is the kind of intersection of heat, because heat is also you know, another way to think about, you know, environmental goods and harms. So what we see here is a kind of heat map on the left. And then you can see the relationship between the heat and vegetation cover in the city, in the urban area. So obviously the sort of red, yellow, orange end of the spectrum is where it's much hotter. And then on the blue sort of green end of the spectrum is where it is much cooler. So you can see how this sort of spatially lays out, in this case, in the city of Toronto. So this includes, you know, what we can sort of, you know, tell from this heat map, to some extent at least, is, you know, proximity to water, right? The Lake Ontario is there, canopy, tree cover, parks, you know, green space, etc. And then also, you know, the inverse, where are there more roads, more concrete, you know, these kinds of things. So Stephanie, if you want to change the slide. And so what they've done, in a really, I think, compelling kind of visual way, and actually, if you go on their website, it's quite dynamic. So it's more animated than what I'm showing here. But what they've then done is taken those sort of precincts by, you know, how they're color coded, and map this over both income data and then immigration status. And so you can see that so on the left, you'll see that the poorer communities are very, very clearly those that are much hotter. And again, this is just within the city of Toronto, and you can see that there, you know, these things vary quite dramatically. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that communities with more immigrants are also much warmer than those with fewer immigrants. And so this sort of again speaks to and reinforces what Stephanie mentioned earlier, but it's often kind of difficult to disaggregate and sort of disentangle class and race. But you can see here that sort of in either case, it is sort of probably likely many of these two variables are working in tandem in this case. So if you live in a wealthier community with fewer immigrants, you're probably, from a heat perspective, much more comfortable. So it will be cooler in the summer, and you won't see those high temperatures. And this is the kind of thing that often I think it's easy to, if we live in this part of the world that is largely insulated, I think, from the most acute impacts of climate change, at least for now. We're not coastal communities, we aren't, equatorial communities, etc. But the kinds of impacts I think that we will see, and I think we've already sort of been experiencing those, are those, potentially longer stretches of very, very hot weather. That is, of course, we know, that it imperils the health of lots of people, these kinds of things. And so heat, I think, is a real significant factor in the context of, things to sort of that will, I think, impact us in the near term in terms of the impacts of climate change. So these kinds of considerations in our cities are, I think, important to sort of be looking at.
And sort of for those of us who live in the Peterborough area, I think there's a couple of really prominent environmental injustices that we can pay attention to, and Peterborough certainly has a sort of specific legacy around environmental harm, which was in part why we were interested in doing this project. And so this, of course, points to the fact that for decades, Curve Lake had 10 to 15 boil water advisories yearly, with one advisory lasting 2 years between 2016 and 2018. And there's a lot of harm that comes with living without clean water. And this harm is across Canada. And former Chief Emily Weetung was quoted as saying, this inequality in access to clean drinking water for Indigenous communities has hit a breaking point. For some, the boil water advisory is just an ongoing symbol of colonization. And we understand it in that same frame as well. Of course, in March 2022, there was an $8 billion settlement on boil water advisories, of which Curve Lake was a leading part of that court case, which includes $2 billion in compensation and $6 billion for water treatment. But there is, to us, no question that it was a story of environmental injustice, and likely will remain so for a while. The other story that we all probably know, if we're from this place, is the toxic legacy associated with General Electric. And as we all know, probably, that General Electric was dubbed Electric City, and GE was one of the city's biggest employers for quite some time, and it's a 125-year history in Peterborough. But the environmental and the health costs associated with these jobs have long been borne by working class employees, who, as many of you know, had fought this decades-long battle with the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board to be compensated for cancers they say are a result of their work as part of the plant. And so, one environmental occupational disease expert called the factory in its heyday a cancer generator. And at least 3,000 chemicals were actively in use at General Electric, according to John Ball, one-time secretary of the health committee. So I guess our point in bringing these examples and in this broader kind of question about this project and how it fits into research around environmental injustice and what environmental justice could look like is the emphasis that we need to think about human rights and environmental rights together. That thinking about them separately does violence to both, right? That we need to think about these environmental questions and their equity implications if we're going to get this right and move forward in a just way. So now we finally get to our project. So what we're doing is a few things. I'm going to talk about two, and Michael's going to talk about two, since we seem to have figured out the tag teaming thing, maybe. So the mention of the project is kind of a historical and archival analysis. And this is sort of my area of the history, environmental history stuff is an area that I know a little bit about. And so there's a couple of different dimensions to this. I have a student who's currently working on an environmental history of GE, and she's looked at all of their archival documents. The archivists at Trent Valley Archives and the Peterborough Museum have been amazing, as they always are, in helping us sort through mountains of documents, plant news, et cetera, as the student begins to kind of craft this environmental history of GE. So, and then she's also interviewing surviving spouses of GE workers and GE workers themselves, if they're still with us. We're also taking a broader look at the environmental history of Peterborough beyond General Electric, to look at other industrial sites, to look at the development of the Trent Severn Waterway as a question of environmental justice, to look at the broader impacts of settler colonialism on these lands. So thinking about this as, what are the questions around environmental justice, and what have the key moments of resilience been or key resistance to that environmental injustice been, is kind of this broader historical piece. The second part of this project is we are doing lots of GIS mapping. And this is the part that we're going to show you today, because this is where we have some preliminary data. And very broadly, what it tries to understand is the relationship between demographic factors, such as race, income, gender, education, employment, single family households, citizenship, and so on, and to think about that and to map that in relation to the presence of environmental goods and bads. So to think about if there is a relationship between those demographic factors and the experience of, and my dog is barking, I'm sure you can hear, the experience of environmental harm or environmental health, I guess, if we want to put it that way. I'm going to mute, and then Michael can talk about the other two.
Yeah, so in addition to trying to get in some sense, kind of bird's eye perspective of environmental injustice in the Peterborough area through these, maybe larger data sets, lots of StatsCan data, these kinds of things. We also want to try to get a more idiosyncratic picture, I think, as well. And so this will include working with people to try to better understand, how people experience environmental goods in bads in their communities. And so we'll be using a couple of techniques. One is participatory mapping, essentially. And so we'll be working with, 15, 20 people maybe. And photo voice as well, I should say. So photo voice, what this is it's people actually, they'll be taking pictures. We're going to try to engage them in this mapping and picture taking process over the course of about a year. And we're going to ask them to sort of take pictures of, again, how they experience their just daily lives, where do they see environmental goods, where do they see environmental bads, these kinds of things. And then 4 times throughout the course of the year, we'll get together for kind of conversation and sharing of these images and experiences, etc. And again, that will, I think, create some really rich understanding, I think, of how people, across various parts of the city and county, again, sort of encounter environmental goods and bads. And again, I think this can be fed into the policymaking process as well, potentially, and broader kind of change initiatives, hopefully. The last piece is oral history. So we'll be speaking with, in this case, in particular, older people, and again, ideally racialized and indigenous people in the area, to get a better sense of, over time, how they've experienced, the environmental injustice, environmental goods and bads. In this case, we're also going to work with Patty Shaughnessy, who's Irish Anishinaabe, a filmmaker and just all around brilliant, captivating person, she's going to, we'll be working with her on this film project that will, that will include these oral histories. So that will be probably in year 3, I guess, of the project. So a bit down the road, but anyways, that sort of gives you an idea of some of the other, the kind of more qualitative, I guess, aspects of the research project. In terms of timelines, I'm getting anxious just looking at this timeline, actually. I'm sort of regretting including it now, but anyways, this just gives you a kind of, I guess, a broad overview of the kinds of timelines that we're working with. As Stephanie mentioned, we submitted, I guess, this funding application in 2021.
Yep.
Yeah, and it takes a while to find out whether or not you get the money. So we found that out in the spring of 2022-ish, I guess. And the project will see us through to the end of 2024. So we have a good couple of years, and of course, the secret is that you can often get extensions from CRRC, which is the funding body. So we may well be in the position to be asking for an extension at some point. But anyways, at this point, these are the timelines that we're working with.
Yeah, and I will say, so I think that Michael is right. One of the reasons that we're going to be asking probably for an extension for 1 year is because we've really struggled to access data. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But one of the things that we sort of found in a very preliminary and probably pretty obvious way to many people, based on StatsCan data and based on the really excellent work of the United Way's research team, is that the Peterborough is a deeply unequal place, right? There's lots of polarization between particularly rich and poor. And in a city of about 85,000 people, over 40% earn less than $30,000 per year after taxes, right? This is from the United Way's research. In 2015, 15.2% of individuals and 31.7% of lone parent families were considered low income in the StatsCan analysis. This is from the census data from 2016, though we are now currently working with 21 data. As of 2021, 20% of children under the age of 6 live in poverty. And what we know is that poverty is often deeply racialized and gendered, with communities of color in Canada experiencing rates of poverty up to 4 times the national average, and racialized and immigrant women experiencing poverty at 28%, to the national average. So, and Peterborough is a different kind of place, right? It's changing demographically. We're interested in charting that change. And we want to figure out the ways in which this maps on to environmental hazards, both in terms of, all of those demographic variables that I talked about earlier. So race, gender, class, single parent households, income, education, all of those sorts of things. And so, Michael, are you talking about this? Yeah, Michael's talking about this.
Yeah.
I'll stop talking.
And I wonder if maybe I can share my screen.
Oh yeah, let me stop sharing.
Yeah, okay. So we worked with some students at Fleming College who have put together, and we'll put the link to this website in the chat in a minute as well. So we worked with these wonderful students here from Fleming College, who put together some of our preliminary data that we've been able to collect. But I should mention, though, that one of the, again, I think we've already mentioned this, but it's worth underscoring. One of the key things we're finding is that it's actually very, very difficult to access the kind of data I think that we need for this project. So it's taken some time and some digging. So I'll just start with this map, and I'll maybe just quickly flip through a couple of them. What this one shows here is this is the National Pollution Registry inventory, which when facilities hit a certain threshold of pollution emittance, they need to be registered with this national body, and so this national body keeps track of those. And then, there's various kinds of reporting requirements, etc. So we have some sense of where these polluting factories or whatever they are. And so you can see here where they're located in Peterborough in relation to the rest of the city. So if we just scroll down, I'll zoom past this piece, although, again, feel free to look at it. It's just a bit more of the kind of story, but I want to get to this map where some of the point pollution, sure, I'll just scroll a little more, it begins to be layered over. Oh, there we go. Begins to be layered over. So income data, again, we don't necessarily, in these maps, we don't have data on racialization or immigration status, etc. But we do have income data. And so we begin to map income in the city. And if you scroll down a bit more, you can see community housing. And I think it's, 53% of community housing is found, of course, within these low income tracts. And then, sorry, which is the one I'm looking for? Oh, no, that's not the one.
Are you looking at for the heat map?
Yeah. Oh, did I miss
If you go back up and then go again and click on heat map.
Oh, this one, yeah, right. That's one. Yeah. Right. Okay, so you can see here that 22% of polluting facilities within the census area are located in the areas with the highest number of low-income residents. So you can see, this sort of, demonstrates kind of this overlay of income, of low income, and those point source pollution that was on the previous map. Okay.
Do you want me to switch back?
Yeah, maybe we could. Yeah, maybe. Is it? Yeah, I don't need to. Yeah, sure. I'll stop sharing. You can switch back to the.
Okay. So the other thing that this is the place that I want to be. The other thing that the students from Fleming discovered, as we've been kind of saying all along, when they went to look at drinking water quality, especially on First Nations reserves, what they found is that policymakers hadn't been collecting data around waterborne illness or tracking diseases generally known to stem from water contamination. And so this was another data gap, and they have this section on the website that they prepared for us that's called Mind the Data Gap, and it's particularly about the fact that we were talking about this before the presentation started, that it's hard to have a policy solution for something that you're not tracking. It's hard to have a policy solution for things that you're tracking but don't care about either. But when something is not quantifiable or mappable in the way that it needs to be, it makes it really difficult to kind of press that forward at a policy level. So this has been, and I think it's been surprising, at least I can speak for myself. The most surprising thing about this project so far, and the reason that we need probably a bit more time, has been that this struggle to get our hands on mappable and granular data, like sort of really postal code level data to help us explore these questions. So what happens next? So we've recently written a short piece in collaboration with Community Race Relations Peterborough and also the Kawartha World Issues Centre on the Building Back Differently project, which is a partnership with the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough about this project. And I think Michael's going to put the link in the chat. We are working on a website that should be live pretty soon. We're recruiting a whole bunch of graduate students to this work. So if you know of a student or you yourself are interested in doing graduate work, we are recruiting master's students that have an interest in GIS mapping and community mapping. in community engaged qualitative research, and also in the intersection between environmental history and environmental justice. So let us know. We are, beginning to start sharing the results, as preliminary as they are, about this project. And so we're very grateful to Reem for the invitation. And you can certainly feel free to share any information about the project that you would like, in any way that you wish. And certainly if you are interested in being involved in the project in any way, we would welcome having you. So at the end, after questions, there's or maybe I'll just go to the slide now that has our contact information too. So feel free to reach out, and we're happy to receive questions in the chat now, if we understand that's your practice. So let me just put up our contact information. This is our Twitter and Instagram, which we have maybe 3 followers, and I think one is me and one is Michael. So if you want to follow us, we would be very appreciative. And our almost ready website is being prepared by somebody who's much tech savvier than either Michael or I. So yeah, feel free to reach out, and even you can just call us too. That's fine. So I'm gonna stop sharing for now, and I'm gonna look at the chat